going to be completely honest with you. When I started crafting together the outline for this full stack web developer roadmap series, I didn't want to cover responsive web design. I'm not an amazing designer myself. It's a little bit painful for me to try to make different designs, but I realized that as I was going through this series, which you can check out right here if you don't know what I'm talking about, but as I was going through the series, I realized if I don't teach responsive web design, then we're going to be creating, websites and web apps that make our users bang their heads on their desk. As you saw in the intro, our goal as web developers is to avoid our users hurting their eyes after they look at our web application on a desktop device, a tablet, a mobile device, or whatever they're viewing it on. Let's take a look at some of the prerequisites. It's basically just HTML and CSS, which we covered for the most part in the prior lessons of this series. Now let's talk about this for just a second on what we're going to be covering here, because this is a massive topic that I cannot do justice to if I'm not defining exactly what we're going to be learning. I'm going to start on the right side of this screen. And as I said, I am not the best designer in the world. Graphic design is generally a painful experience for myself. I've put together a few decent designs over the years, but nothing that I could call myself a designer in any form or fashion. But the good news is, as a full stack web developer, you do not need to be a great graphic designer. For that reason, I'm not going to teach you the design side of things. And as we've talked about previously in the series, we're going to be going through and making some of these challenges with HTML, CSS, and even JavaScript. So this is Frontend Mentor, and this is one of the designs that we're going to create after we learn about CSS Grid and Flexbox over the next couple videos. And you can see that there's a responsive design here. We're going to talk more about that in just a second. Likewise, we have this challenge right here, which is just another, looks like crowdfunding page. So this will be a fun one to do. And what you'll notice here is that as we're going through our course here, we're leveraging existing designs. We're not trying to do this on our own. And that is the point of this video, is to teach you how to leverage those existing designs and make sure that everything is responsive and looks good on all devices that you might see it on. So here are the lessons that we're going to learn in this video. First off, what is responsive design? Now you probably have a general idea of that, but we'll dive a little deeper into it. Next, we'll be talking about mobile first versus desktop first designs. And honestly, it took me years to figure out what this actually meant, which looking back is kind of silly because it's not that hard, but we're going to talk about that. So mobile first versus desktop first. Next up, we'll talk about CSS breakpoints, how they relate to media queries, and how we actually write media queries within our web apps. And then finally, I'm going to leave you with a responsive design checklist. This is not going to be super detailed, just a high-level checklist that you can go through to make sure you're covering your bases, and a little project. What we're going to do is take our design from a previous video. So it was the previous video, I'll link to it up here, where we designed this pricing card. And what you'll see with this pricing card is as we resize the screen, it just gets cut off. So I'm going to teach you in the challenge at the end of the video how we can take this situation and turn it into this one, where as we resize, it gets close, and then boom, it breaks and it looks a lot better on a mobile device, something that your users will not be angry about. Let's go ahead and dive into that question of what is responsive web design? And the answer to that, at least in my head, I like to keep it simple so that we can remember it. If your users hurt their eyes looking at your web page on a desktop device or a mobile device or a tablet or whatever they're viewing it on, then you have not designed it responsively. So that is a good little way to remember what responsive design is all about. Now, here's the thing. It's 2021 and there's a lot of website builders. There's, Squarespace, there's Wix, WordPress, a bunch of other website builders that kind of take care of this responsiveness for you. And for that reason, most websites nowadays are responsive and they look pretty good. So I had a hard time actually finding a bad example of responsive web design. For that reason, I created one that's not going to be anything crazy, but let me close out a few tabs here. And what I created was this, very basic example of bad web design. But a few things that you'll notice here is as I make it larger and larger, so this is a pretty big screen I'm working on, you'll notice a few things. So first off, as my eyes read across this text, I have to cover a lot of real estate on the screen to actually get through one single line of text. And that's kind of a no-no when it comes to responsive web design. You want that text to be, generally less than, we'll call it 700 pixels. So it needs to be, in the middle of the screen, and it needs to be narrow enough for your eyes to not have to basically move great distances to read it. So that's one piece of this. Another piece is you see this nav bar up here. We've got a couple links on the left and a couple on the right, and they are very spaced out to the point where it's almost too spaced out. So those are a couple issues going on with this on a very wide screen. Now, if we make this more narrow, you're going to see something that is just going to hurt your eyes, which is not the point of responsive design. So as we get smaller, this could be a mobile device of some sort. You'll see that we have two columns here. And that's not going to work on a mobile device. You want to have most content to be, full width on a mobile screen. And then also you have all of these links up at the top, and the contact link is almost getting cut off to the point where you can't even click it or see it or anything. So that's a big problem if we were viewing this on a mobile device. Now, what I did was I went ahead and improved it a little bit. So this is the improved version of this design, where you'll see on a wide screen, the article text is only a certain width. I think I made it something like 650 pixels wide as a maximum. And you can see that we can skim this text without, moving our heads from left to right. And then also you'll see that the nav bar has been brought in, so these links are not, at the very edges of our page. And then as we resize this, you're going to see that everything changes. So right around here, I believe, somewhere right there. So you'll see at this breakpoint, this column goes under the main text, which is going to be a little bit easier to see. And then also you'll see the links at the top are going to turn into a navigation menu that it doesn't do anything because I didn't want to spend the time to do that, but this would be like a drop down so that you could see the links there, and then I left the home link so that you can still navigate that way. So even on a really small device, you can see that most of this looks pretty good now. Obviously, this is not the most visually pleasing design in the world. It's not meant to be. It's meant to show you generally what responsive design is. To get a better grasp of what this is all about, let's take a look at really good examples of responsive design, and I'll point out a few things that are good about them. The two portfolio sites we're going to be looking at are Cassie Evans. This is just a really nice looking site, and Jason Langsdorf. I think I said that right. I don't know either of these people, but I have found their portfolio sites and they're just really visually pleasing, and they've done a really good job at responding to different screen sizes. So as we look at this, let's go ahead and break this window out so that we can kind of resize it. But let's just take a look at how these websites react to different screen sizes. So here is Cassie's website, and this is the home page. You'll see that as we resize this to a more mobile device, that big text is going to get broken out to the main portion. We're going to get rid of that image right there. So it's a little nicer to see on a mobile device. And then as you scroll down, you'll see everything's kind of full width. If we were to bring this back to a desktop, now it's got a nice little layout. So you kind of get the point. This is just a really nice example of good responsive design right here. Likewise, Jason's site is pretty good in this respect. So you'll see there's this picture here on the left on a desktop device, and as we resize, it's going to get put on top. The button gets a little bigger, so it's easier to click on a mobile device. And as we go smaller and smaller, you're going to see that it's really easy to navigate around. If we click the blog, you'll see it's the same thing. On a mobile device, it looks really nice and everything is easy to click. On a desktop, it's also really nice, and you can see that it's in the middle of the screen. This was what I was talking about earlier. You don't want your text to be the full length of a desktop device because some of them are going to be huge screens and you'll have to move your head to read the text in the first place. Next up, we have to talk about mobile first versus desktop first web designs. When I was first learning, I'll be honest, I could not figure out what the difference between these were. Everyone was talking about it and saying, oh, you want to do mobile first, but I never understood what they were talking about. And it wasn't until I realized that these concepts of mobile or desktop first design has nothing really to do with the design phase of a project, and it has everything to do with when we start writing our CSS. So it's really important when you're learning all of these concepts to really separate the design phase from the coding phase of a project. You don't want to get into the situation where you're trying to design something and code it at the exact same time. Because after all, designing something is very right-brained and coding something is very left-brained, so you're going to get to the point where you're just in complete confusion if you're trying to do both at the same time. So my rule, for myself at least, is before I write any code whatsoever, I need to have at least a basic visual representation of what I'm trying to create. But if you're a very mediocre designer like myself, or if you just have no design skills whatsoever, what do? Do we actually try to design something, or do we just hire someone to do it? That's a question that I was asking when I first started. In my opinion, you really have three options when it comes to, getting that first visual representation of your web page in front of you. Number one, you can hire a designer and have them design it for you. But in most cases, especially if you're watching this, you don't have the time to go figure out what designer you want to hire. And then furthermore, you don't need to pay anyone to learn how to code. So that's kind of out of the equation. That's for later down the road when you're trying to actually build a product and sell it, and you need to have a really professional design built. The second option is to browse the internet for free designs, and that's what we've done with the Frontend Mentor challenges. This is a great way to kind of outsource that step for free. And what you can see is we've got these designs that we're going to be creating already built for us, and we don't have to think about them at all. As we scroll through this, you'll see that there are desktop versions here, and then there's also mobile versions so that you can see how do we want this to look on both sizes of screen. If you're not super worried about what your end product is going to look like, but you want to still make it mobilely responsive, you can put together a wireframe, and you can use a tool such as Figma. So this is a really popular place to put together a wireframe or even a mock-up, which is a complete representation of what you want to build. But usually pencil and paper is good enough for a basic wireframe. And your goal with a wireframe is to just get a general idea of where the elements that you have on your page should be arranged based on the size of the screen. So I'll put something up on the screen, just a basic wireframe that I created for, we'll just call it like a blog, where you have a sidebar and you have some regular content, and you can see a desktop version and a mobile version. And this is entirely sufficient if you're just trying to get a basic understanding of what you're creating. Now, like I said, if you're trying to build out a product or something, or if you're a great designer, you can use a tool like Figma, which is going to allow you to put together full-on mock-ups. And the difference between, say, a wireframe and a mock-up is a wireframe doesn't really care about, the colors and the fonts, all that detail. It just cares about kind of the layout of the elements on the page. Now, a mock-up is a full-on representation of what you're trying to build. So a tool like Figma or Adobe XD or Sketch or a couple other different good tools for that can allow you to create full-on mock-ups like the one that we're looking at here with Frontend Mentor. So this has not been coded yet, but it's a perfect visual representation of what we do want to code. And you can do that with those tools. So coming back to the original question, what's the difference between mobile first and desktop first design? You see with all these mock-ups, we have a version of the desktop and mobile on both. So does it really matter which one you create first? Well, the answer to that is you're asking the wrong question. Now, this took me a long time to realize, but mobile first and desktop first has nothing to do with the actual design phase. It has everything to do with when you start writing that CSS and when you put together your breakpoints. So in order to understand these better, we have to dive into something called a media query with CSS, and along with that concept comes the concept of breakpoints. To better understand what I mean when I say breakpoint, let's look at a code pen that I put together to explain it. Now, if I said I want a breakpoint at 600 pixels, what I mean by that is as the screen gets smaller or bigger than a width of 600 pixels, I want to have different CSS rules for both of those. So in other words, if I'm on a mobile device or a desktop device, I want different CSS. Let's do a quick review. So let me come to a page that I'm not really using here, so let me close out a few of these. This is just the web docs for CSS. We're going to right click and inspect and then go to the console. And if we were to type window.innerWidth, it's going to give us a number. And that number, 714, is the visible width of the screen. So as we resize this, so we're kind of pulling it to the left and right and resizing it, we can run this again and you're going to see we get a different number. So now it's only 356 pixels wide. So that's what we talk about when we say the viewport width. So what I've done is I've written a little bit of JavaScript here. I'm going to make this slightly bigger for us to see. And what I've done here in the bottom is basically said, when it resizes the screen, I want to change the content of this up here. So I've got a span, an HTML span that has a number in it, and that's going to be populated by the window.innerWidth property every time the screen resizes. So in effect, you're going to see as I drag this, this number is going to update live. And also what I've done, and we're going to learn more about what this is I've written a breakpoint at a minimum width of 600 pixels. And I've included some different styles within that breakpoint. So one of those is going to be the H1 tag is going to have a color of red on screens that are bigger than 600 pixels or equal to. And then when it is not, so a mobile device, we're going to have a color of green. So you'll see as I resize this, we get closer to 600. So we're about to hit it. And when I hit 600, it turns green. So we'll go back up, turns red, back down, it turns green. So that is the basics of a CSS breakpoint. Now, of course, changing the color of some text based on the screen is not really that useful, and you probably won't see it all that often. But what you will see is CSS that affects the layout of your HTML changing on different screen sizes. Let me go ahead and uncomment some of the code here that I've created. And what I've put in here is a couple of pictures. These are just placeholder pictures from the placeholder.com. And then we come down into the CSS and you can see that when we have a screen size that's a mobile screen size, so when we say mobile first, it's all of these rules at the top, we have a width of 75%. And as we come down into this breakpoint of 600 pixels, you're going to see that the image width is going to be auto, which basically means it's going to fill its container. So in effect, our breakpoint at 600 pixels is going to say, okay, if it's 600 or greater, I want to have these images sitting next to each other. Otherwise, I want to put them 100% width of its container and they'll stack on top of each other. So as we resize this, we get closer and closer to 600, it's going to change. So watch what happens when we get below 600. Right there, you'll see that the images went to 100% width, or not 100% width, 75% width, and they're going to stack on top of each other because they no longer fit next to each other on the screen. So that's a good example of a basic CSS breakpoint and how we can use it to rearrange the layout of our page. So you have a basic idea of what a breakpoint is in CSS, but the question becomes, what breakpoints do I actually use? And there's not really a simple answer to that. Let's take a look at this web page right here. This is screen sizes. .es there. That's pretty clever. You're going to see that there are a lot of different devices that we could possibly build our web page for. And there's no way that we can go through all of these. There's hundreds and hundreds of different devices. There's no way that we can optimize for all of them. So we have to do our best at guessing, which screens do we want to set our breakpoints on and design them a little bit differently. In general, mobile devices are going to be somewhere in the range of 320 to call it 480 pixels wide. You'll have tablets between 600 and 800 pixels. You'll have, regular sized laptops around the, 1024 to 1440 pixel range. And then bigger desktop devices are going to have a width of, call it 2500 pixels. So those are just generalizations, but as you can see on the screen, there's all sorts of different numbers, and I don't want to get into the discussion of things like pixel density and what is the difference between the actual width of a device and the adapted pixel interpretation for us as web developers. It's a pretty complicated topic. If you can just remember those guidelines that I just mentioned, you should be good. So as you're deciding what breakpoints you need to use for your web page or your web app, you have to ask 3 questions, in my opinion. So the first one is going to be, will the web page even be used on a mobile device, and is that your intention? There are plenty of apps that are not meant to be used on a mobile device. So think about budgeting apps or big spreadsheets, things that just don't look very good on a mobile device. You probably don't want to waste your time, energy, and maybe even money to create a pleasing mobile experience. You're just going to say to your users, hey, this is not meant for a mobile device. You should be using our application on a desktop. Another consideration would be, are you offering a mobile application? If you are, a good example might be something like YouTube. So the YouTube application on a mobile device is really nice to scroll through and use, but their web version, so if you were to open up the browser and then type in youtube.com rather than opening up the mobile app, it'll still be a semi-nice experience, but it definitely won't be as great of an experience as opening the mobile app. So if you're creating something and you plan on making a mobile application, you may not have to put quite as much time and thought into how it looks on different screens. The second question you might ask is it actually important to have a different design for each screen? If you've just got a basic website that just has text on it and you don't have a lot of images or anything like that, then it may not be that important to have a bunch of breakpoints. You may be able to get away with one design for all devices and it'll work just fine. And the final question you have to ask is, are there standards for this? Why can't I just use the industry standard for what everyone is using for breakpoints? And unfortunately, given the fact there are so many different screen sizes and screen sizes are constantly changing as new physical devices are released to the world, there's not really an industry standard that we can go off of. While there are no industry standards per se, there are these things called CSS frameworks. And as I talked about in the prior videos, we're not going to be covering in depth any one CSS framework, given the fact that I don't want to lock you into any one thing. I want to teach you the fundamentals of CSS rather than trying to teach you a framework. But having a framework to piggyback off of when it comes to breakpoints is a very smart decision, at least in my opinion. These guys that create the frameworks are thinking about, breakpoints all the time. They have to incorporate those breakpoints into their own frameworks, and therefore, if it's good enough for them, then it's good enough for me and hopefully everyone watching this, given the fact that breakpoints are not an exact science, and these guys think about it a lot more than, someone like myself would. One of the most popular frameworks, or at least long-standing CSS frameworks, is Bootstrap. Now, Bootstrap, you'll find it in several tutorials. You can kind of read up on it. It's basically, a CSS framework is all about making your job writing CSS easier. So a lot of times these CSS frameworks are going to create grid systems and layout systems so that you can just have predefined classes that you can pass in to make your sites mobilely responsive and stuff like that. So with that, they have their standard set of breakpoints. And if you scroll down to on Bootstrap's documentation, it has a list of these breakpoints, and you can see that there are about 5 of them. So by default, Bootstrap is what we call mobile first, and you're going to start to catch on to what this means. And when I say mobile first, it means that we are first designing our CSS for a mobile device. And then what we're saying is anything greater than 576 pixels will have these styles, and then anything greater than 768 will have these different styles. So basically you're starting with the mobile device, you're writing your CSS, and then you're writing little blocks of code with these breakpoints to define, oh, what happens when we have a bigger device. So that's kind of what we mean when we say mobile first. So here are the breakpoints. You got 576, 768, 992, 1200, and 1400 for small, medium, large, extra large, and XXL. So those are the standards for Bootstrap, and they're going to be our standards. But the question is, do we have to use all of them? And the answer to that is no. We don't need to use every single breakpoint here. We just need to use enough breakpoints to make our designs look suitable on all devices. And based on what you're creating, that may be 1 or 2 breakpoints, or it may be all of these breakpoints that you have right here. If we're looking at an example like this pricing card that we created, I'm not sure really what happened here, but anyways, we have this pricing card, and for this, we really only need 1 breakpoint. Now, if you're incorporating this into an application, you might have a couple more, but really we just have 2 states that we have to create. We've got this full-on state, which can be on basically tablets and above, and then we have this mobile state where everything's stacked on top of each other. So in this case, we only had to come down here and write 1 single breakpoint. So we have the min width being 576, which I got from right here. So anything greater than a small device or a mobile device is going to have X styles. All right, so we've been in theory land here this whole video, and we've been talking about the design aspects and breakpoints and how do we choose them, but we haven't actually written any code yet. And I want to do that now. I want to show you exactly how to write a CSS breakpoint and how that relates to this thing called media queries. So I'm going to come to my code pen and make a new one so that we can just have a playground to work in. And then down here in the CSS, this is where we're going to write our breakpoints, but we first need to have some HTML. So we'll say responsive web design example. And from here, let's just put in an H1, welcome to the tutorial. All right, so we have some HTML to work with. And now down in the CSS section, we can write a breakpoint. And the basic syntax of a CSS breakpoint is this. So what I copied in here is what we actually call a media query, and the breakpoint is the number that we pass in as a minimum width to that media query. Now we have a little bit more to learn about this syntax because we have to ask ourselves, what does this @media actually mean? And if we go over to the MDN documentation, let me close out of here. This is what we've been using so far in this series, and you can come down to Technologies, CSS, and then if you come to the CSS reference. So in the CSS reference, the first paragraph has all sorts of links that we can go to. And it says, use this reference to browse alphabetical index of all the properties, pseudo classes, pseudo elements, data types, functional notations, and @rules. And this last one, the @rules, is what we want to click on. So what these are, they're CSS statements that instruct CSS how to behave. So that would be fitting into our categorization of media queries perfectly. So if we scroll down, you'll see down here in the index, these are all the different @rules or whatever tells the CSS how to behave. And if we click on media, that's going to take us to the media query page. So this is an @rule that can be used to apply part of a style sheet based on the result of 1 or more media queries. All right, so then we come down to the syntax, and you're going to see some pretty complicated stuff being written, but this is the basics of a media query. And if we come back to our example here, you'll see the basic syntax just has @media, and then in parentheses we write whatever rule we have. And then down here, this is where the CSS is going to go. So if we wanted to specify some CSS for our H1, we're going to put it there. So anytime the screen is greater than 756 pixels, the text will be red. So if we shrink this, it goes back to black, and then we go to red. So that's the very basic syntax, but in this rule, we're actually selecting every type of media device. So if we go back to the documentation, and Let me drag this over so we're not getting so confused with our tabs. But if we come to the media rule and scroll down to the description, you'll see that there's this concept of media types. So we have all, print, screen, and speech. And you can actually define within your media query which device types you're actually trying to target. Now in our case, when we wrote this one, we're just saying we want all devices. Now you can also specify in that rule that you only want to target certain devices. Now we're going to be working with screens mostly. That's like a mobile, like an iPhone or Android, a tablet, or a desktop screen. So that's kind of our forte as web developers. But you also have print and speech, which are some more specific use cases that you can target. So let's see how we could change our rule to target those devices. So if we said media all, and this is going to say that we want to target all media types. So this is the equivalent of this. Those are the same thing. But if we come in here and we say media print and, this is only going to apply to print is basically like a print preview view on a screen. So as you can see, our rule down here of the color red no longer applies to this text because we're only targeting print media devices. Likewise, we could put in speech, and that's also not going to work because this is not a speech media type. But if we put in the word screen, it's going to now apply because this is a screen, and this rule should apply to it. Now with these media rules, we can add some logic in here. I'm not going to get too deep into this, but I want to at least show you what it is. So let's say that we wanted to target only screens at a width between 400 and 600 pixels. Now we could do that in one media rule, and the way that we would do that is by writing some logical operators within CSS. So if you remember with JavaScript, if we came down here into the JavaScript section and we just typed in some basic code, we can use conditionals. So we can say, we can create an if statement that says if my var is greater than 10 and my var is less than 100, then we'll do something within this code. So you can see that this little and symbol is the logical operator that we're using. Now CSS actually has logical operators just like this. So we don't need this JavaScript code anymore, but we can rearrange this rule to have those logical operators and target multiple conditions. So let's go ahead and do that. Let me get rid of this comment. The first thing that we're going to do when we're having these logical operators, we have to put this operator called only. So only when it's a screen is when we're going to use this rule, and then we can drop down onto some new lines just to separate these things out. We'll put our brackets down here, and now we can add another one here. So we can say and max width is something like 800 pixels. So let's just change this. We'll go, what did I say we wanted? We wanted something between 400 pixels and 600 pixels. And now what we're saying with this rule is, so at media, so we want an at rule for CSS, we only want to target screen media types, which is what we're looking at here. And we want to target something with a minimum width of 400 pixels. And we want to target something with a max width of 600 pixels. So basically what we're saying here is only screens between 400 and 600 pixels should this H1 CSS rule apply. So if we make the screen really big, that's not within those bounds. But as we go down, and you can, down here, right at the bottom, you'll see a little pixel indicator as I scroll. But as we get between 400 and 600, we should see it turn red, and then we go back to black as it gets smaller than 400. So you can see how we can use CSS logical operators with our media queries to target different types of conditions. Now you can also bring in other CSS at rules. So if we go back to our documentation, we'll click back. This is our at rules page. And you can see we have media queries, but we also have things like import and supports. So if we click on supports, this basically is an @ rule that lets you check to see if a specific CSS property is supported in the browser that the user is using. So a good example of this is Flexbox and CSS Grid, which we'll learn about in the next few videos. Those are not yet supported by all browsers. Now, most of them do, but things like Internet Explorer, I don't think do, and maybe a couple others with CSS Grid. So you can see in this example, we can use this to basically check whether the display supports display grid property, and then if so, we will use that property within our CSS. So as you can see, media queries and CSS @ rules can give us a whole lot of power when designing our pages for different devices, media types, and different browsers. So we're not going to get too far into it because that's not the point of this video, but I did want to show you the basics of it just so that you were aware. Now, at this point, I want to take you through, we'll call it the 80-20 guide of media queries and CSS breakpoints. I'm going to show you how to take these standard breakpoints that we have from the Bootstrap framework and incorporate it into an actual CSS document. To do that, let me put some images on our page. So we'll say welcome to the tutorial, and then we'll have a bunch of just placeholder images with on the screen. So what we want to do with these images is make them responsive based on the screen size. So something that I can think of is maybe on mobile devices, we want it to be 100% width, just like we're seeing here where they're vertically stacked. Then maybe on tablet devices, we can have 2 images per row. And then on a desktop device that is much larger, we could have, we'll call it 4 images in one row across the page. As I just described, we want to have 3 different states of our web page. We want a mobile display, a tablet display, so 2 images, and a desktop display, 4 images. So we have 3 states, and that requires 2 CSS breakpoints to achieve. Now, you'll remember Bootstrap has 5 of them. We only need 2 of these because we're not making a super complex design. And that is a good demonstration of how you have to look at what your purpose is and then decide how many breakpoints. You don't want to just throw in a bunch of breakpoints just to have them there. The first thing we need to do is put in a basic CSS reset. Now, we talked about this in prior videos of this series, so be sure to watch those if you haven't. But it's just changing the box sizing so that we can fit these images reliably next to each other without any unwanted behavior. The next thing we'll do is we'll add in our breakpoint templates. If we go to Bootstrap and look at what we need here, I think what we're going to do is grab this one right here. So I just want to mention here, this top one, this is not actually a breakpoint that we need. This is kind of just the default. So as we talked about, this is a mobile first approach where we want to design the regular CSS or the default CSS to apply to a mobile screen. And then we will conditionally style any screens that are larger than a mobile device with these breakpoints. So we're going to grab the greater than or equal to 576. So that's basically saying what happens on anything greater than a mobile device. And then we also will probably grab the 992, which is basically saying everything greater than, say, a tablet. So mobile, tablet, and desktop is all we need to cover. So we'll say 576 and 992. Let me just jot this down here. So 576 and 992, so I don't forget. And now we can write our media queries. So like I said, you can just use this basic syntax. You don't have to put any of those logical operators in there. And we're going to say min width is 576 pixels, and then put some brackets to break it down. We will copy this, put it right below, and change this number to 992. We can get rid of the comments here, and we should be set up to have our CSS breakpoints now. Now, right now, the pictures on the screen, no matter what size screen we have, are not going to be responsive. Now, you'll see that they come next to each other on this larger screen, and that is just because naturally an image is, I believe, an inline block element, which means it doesn't have to have its own line. And these are, I believe, 500 pixel images. Yeah, we put in 500 pixels for these images using the placeholder service. And therefore, if the screen is bigger than, say, 1,000 pixels, so 500 plus 500, those inline blocks are going to wrap up onto the line. So this is nothing of CSS that we've written, it's just the natural flow of HTML. So in our mobile first approach, let's go down to a mobile device, which is going to be right here. And what we want to do within this CSS, we'll go right after the CSS reset. And what we will do is we'll target all images on the page and we'll give them a width of 100%. And what that's going to do is it's going to resize all of the images to be 100% of the viewport. And you'll notice there's a little bit of padding. That's just natural, a default padding and margin of this browser in the CodePen environment. But we have these as 100% width. Now, as we resize this, you're going to see that it maintains that 100% width all the way up to these larger screens. And of course, this is a way too large of an image to have on the screen. So we want to wrap these on, next to each other on the lines. So what we'll first do is we'll come into this media query, which is basically going to say anything greater than a mobile device is what we want here. So we'll target images, and what this is going to say is if the screen is greater than 576 pixels, we want to override the original image style and put it to something else. So in this case, we'll give it a width of we wanted 2 per screen, so we'll say 50%. And now we should see these wrapping, no, they're not wrapping, let's change it to 49%. Okay, there we go. Now the reason we have to do 49%, this is not going to be a problem once we learn Flexbox and CSS Grid, but it's just white space and a couple other things that are causing this, so don't mind the fact that it's 49%, it should technically be 50. So as you see here, on a mobile device, we have 100% width and they stack on top. Then as we resize to be greater than 576, they will break onto 2 per row. And then now we want to make it 4 per row once we get above 992 pixels. So right now it's going to stay as 2 per row, no matter how big we get. But if we come down here and add an image style and give it a width of 24%, you'll see that as we get larger, it's going to put 4 per row. So now we see we have 1 per row here, 2 per row on a tablet, and 4 per row on a desktop device. So we've successfully written a mobile-first approach to CSS, and we've designed for 3 different screen sizes. Now, I want to walk through how the CSS interpreter is actually working here because sure, we can write these breakpoints, but we really have to understand what's going on. Otherwise, we're going to make a silly mistake that I'm about to show you. So looking at this CSS, we have to ask ourselves, how do we actually read this? Or how would the browser be interpreting this? So by default, we've got all these images here. And when CSS is read, we'll first read the CSS reset. We'll make the border box different. And then as we come down, we'll say, okay, I have an image CSS selector giving it a width of 100%. So the CSS interpreter is going to say, okay, great. The width of all images is now 100%. Now, as we come further down, you'll see the media queries, and the browser will basically say, so is my total width of the viewport greater than 576 pixels? Let's go ahead and make that true. So now we're at the biggest size. And so as the browser's reading this, it says, okay, yeah, it is bigger than 576. So let's go ahead and apply this rule. So it says, all right, now images are not 100%. We're going to replace that with 49%. And then it reads even further down and it sees this next media query and it basically asks itself, okay, is it greater than 992 pixels, the viewport width of the browser? The answer to that in this case is yes. So it's going to say, okay, now my images need to be 24% width, and we're going to replace these previous 2 rules up here. So what we're doing is we're walking through that cascading concept of CSS where it's read from top to bottom, and the last rule, so long as that last rule has the same specificity as rules above it is going to be the one that applies. So where this is important is the order of the breakpoints that you're adding, or the media queries. So if I were to take this last media query and place it above this one, things are going to change for us. And that is because of how the CSS is read from top to bottom. So in this case, what you'll notice is on a mobile device, we look good. It's working fine. But as we go up, we're only going to get 2 images per row, no matter how far or how wide the screen gets. And you might look at your CSS and say, well, why is that? We've defined that anything greater than 992 should get a width of 24%. But the way that CSS is read is top to bottom, and what it's doing here is it's saying, okay, first we have this rule here that sets it to 100%. Then we're going to ask ourselves, is this screen bigger than 992? The answer is yes. So now we're going to set it to 24%. Then it reads down once again and it says, is it greater than 576? And the answer is still yes, because this is inclusive of all screen sizes. So now it's going to replace that image width with 49% and override the 24% right here. So the lesson here is that your media queries, the order of them is very important, and you're going to need to do 2 things. So first, you need to add your media queries at the bottom of your CSS style sheet. And the reason is you've got all these rules for the default style, which would be the mobile screens, and you need these at the end so that they can override those styles. And then second, if you're going with the mobile first approach, which is basically using min widths rather than max width, then you need the greatest width to be at the bottom. So you need to go from smallest to greatest. Otherwise, what we just saw is going to happen and nothing's going to behave as you'd expect. So at this point, I want to revisit this topic of mobile first and desktop first design. I've alluded to it over the last couple of minutes, what this actually is, but I think we're ready to fully understand the difference between the two. Like I said earlier, it has nothing to do with the design phase of your project. When you're just getting the graphic design laid out in your wireframes or your mockups, doesn't really matter because you're going to design multiple screen size designs no matter what. But when we come to write the CSS, the difference is going to be whether we're using media queries with a min width or we're putting in media queries with a max width, because that's going to change how we think about our CSS entirely. In this case, we used min width, which is basically the equivalent to mobile first design, because all of the default styles up here are going to automatically apply to screens, and since we're using min widths, that's going to apply to mobile devices. Now, as we go up in size, that's when we're going to start replacing CSS properties according to those bigger screen sizes. So what you see here is mobile first, and now I'm going to reverse it and we're going to actually do a desktop first approach, which is not what I recommend, but I want to show you the compare and contrast. So if we wanted to go desktop first, then we would just have to change these two to max width. All right, so let's change both min widths to max width, and you'll see that everything is working a little bit differently. It's basically the exact opposite. So as we get bigger, we go to that 100% width, and as we go smaller, we go into the grid, which is obviously not what we want. And the reason is because we thought of it from a mobile first perspective when we built it. So basically, when you're doing desktop first, all of these default rules are going to apply to your desktop devices. So anything that is greater than this, the greatest breakpoint that you've assigned, is going to get all of these default styles. So we're basically starting from the widest, and then as we go down, we're replacing rules. So if we wanted to work this the same as we had before, we're just going to have to change the widths. So all of these rules are for, desktop devices. So we want to replace this 100% with 24%. That should get us back to the point where we have the four pictures per row. Now, as we come down, we're going to change the max width of 576. So this is basically referring to all mobile devices. We want to make this 100% so that on a mobile device, we see them stacked on top of each other. And it's not working. Let me go ahead and refresh the page. to make sure we got this. Oh, actually, this is a good lesson. So when we go from from mobile first to desktop first, the order of the media queries is going to change. So when we had min widths, we said we want the smallest to largest going from top to bottom. But in this case, it's going down the style sheet and it's saying, okay, is the screen less than 576? So let's make it a mobile. It's saying, is it less than 576? The answer is yes, so let's apply an image width of 100%. Then it goes down and it reads, is the max width or is it less than 992? In this case, that is also true. So it's replacing the width to 24%. So that's why we're still seeing the grid there. So if we wanted to make that work, we need to put, for a desktop first approach, we need the largest media queries first going to the smallest. And now we have our intended behavior of 100% width on mobile, and then we should get, let's go ahead and replace this last one here to be 49%. And now we should have a correct design. So 100% on mobile, we'll have 2 images on a tablet, and then we'll have 4 images on the desktop. So as you can see, mobile first versus desktop first is all about how we're writing our media queries and whether we're using mid-widths or max widths. In general, you're going to find that the consensus among the development community is to use a mobile first approach. And the reason behind it is as you're getting into more complex designs, it is just easier to use the natural flow of HTML on a mobile device, so no media queries required, and then tweak it as you get larger. Because in many cases, a desktop first design is probably not going to look very good on a mobile device. But the inverse of that, so a mobile first design, it will probably look okay on a desktop device without any modifications. So in summary, you're basically going to have to write less code in most cases. All right, so we've covered the basics. Now the next question is, what do I actually put within these media queries? And the answer to that is, I can't possibly teach it within one lesson. You're going to learn, how to resize things based on different devices through experience and time. I'm about to show you a basic example of just that, but first I want to leave you with a responsive design checklist. So let's jump over here and go to the checklist. So you can just, take a screenshot of this, write it down, whatever you want to do, but this is what I go through when I'm looking at my design and my web page and testing it on different devices. I want to make sure that I check all of these boxes. And if you can check all these boxes, you've covered 95% of what you need to, and the rest is going to be, just subtle little changes and highly dependent on how many requirements you have for your project. So first up, we want fluid layouts. This is basically saying, what we just looked at, where we have, single images on a mobile device, we have a row of 2 images on a tablet, and a row of 4 images on a desktop. So that's what we mean when we say fluid layouts. We want to make the content, just look good in general. Now, images, we want to make sure that we have the right aspect ratios and we're not stretching images to be, too wide, too tall, too big on certain devices. We also want to do the same thing with text. We don't want to have huge text on a mobile device where you only have, 4 or 5 words per line. That's a really poor user experience. The next thing up is overflow. So that's basically, you don't want to have any text or images or whatever cut off on the side of the screen. So you've probably seen a mobile design before where, half the image is off the screen. You want to avoid that. And then similar to that, we want full width mobile content. So in general, this doesn't apply to everything, but in general, everything that you look at is going to be stacked on top of each other rather than having columns. You never really want columns on a mobile device. And then finally, just general usability. So this is not too hard. Just get a friend, someone who will give you honest feedback, have them play around with your web page on multiple devices, and anyone is going to be able to tell, okay, this doesn't feel right, this one's kind of clunky, it's hard to use this on a mobile device, I'm squinting on the desktop to see this. You should get pretty good feedback, and just using a common sense approach is usually pretty good for this. All right, at this point, we're going to apply these skills we just learned. And we're going to take this pricing card challenge where you can see that everything's getting cut off and it's not responsive, and we're going to make it responsive. So the answer to this is actually relatively simple, and we can do it in one of two approaches. So the first way we could do it is a desktop first approach, which, like I said, I don't recommend that as your default way of approaching CSS. But in this case, we did design this with a desktop first mindset. We didn't really think about mobile design when we were doing this, and therefore in the CSS and the HTML, that has been reflected. So in this case, you can see that the width of this card that we've created, we decided that as we were creating the card, and you can see it right here. So we've assigned a width of 600 pixels to this, and for that reason, I think we can assign a media query or a breakpoint around that 600 pixel mark. Now, if we did it exactly at 600 pixels, then you're going to see a design where, we're at 635 pixels here, and looks like about 600 right here, and obviously there's something cut off. So you want to put a little bit of wiggle room there. So we might want to write our media query to be somewhere around 650 pixels. So what we'll do is we'll come down to the very bottom of the CSS, as we're supposed to with media queries. We'll write @media, and then we'll say max width, because we're solving this in the desktop first approach, because this will be the simplest solution, and we'll say 650 pixels. So dropping down into this CSS rule, all we really have to do is make these the bottom left and the bottom right containers that we created, we want to make them 100% width so that they naturally stack on top of each other. So I believe all we have to do, if I'm thinking about this correctly, is target those two and give them a 100% width when the screen is less than 650 pixels. So the IDs for this would be bottom left section. So let's grab that, throw it in our media query, and paste that in. And then we want to put a comma because we want to also do the same thing for the bottom right section. So let's grab that and put a hashtag to target it, and then we'll make a CSS rule. So right now in this media query, we're saying any screen that's less than 650 pixels, I want to target the bottom left section and the bottom right section by their IDs, and then I want to give them a width of 100%. All right, so at this point our screen is greater than 650, but as we resize, you'll see that it's done something for us, but now we have to figure out what's going on here because we've completely lost the bottom right section. It's pretty much disappeared. And the reason that is happening is because we've set explicit heights on this card. If you scroll up to the top of the CSS, you'll see that we gave the card a width of 600 pixels and a height of 400 pixels. And then we also set the overflow to be hidden, which was what allowed us to make those rounded corners at the bottom. So what's happening here when I resize this, and we're basically losing this right side entirely, is because now when we stack them on top of each other, it's greater than that height of 400 pixels, and we're hiding that overflow content, so it's not being shown here. So if we were to come down to our media query and set the height to be auto, it's going to change something for us, I believe. No, that's not going to change because we don't want to assign that to the sections. We want that to be to the main card. So we need to target the card itself. So down in our media query, we're going to target the card, and now we're going to set the height to be auto, which is going to take away that explicit height and give it its automatic height. And you can see that now we are resizing correctly. But the last problem is you're going to see it's still cut off because for this card component, we still do not have an automatic width. So we've only assigned 100% width to the bottom left and bottom right section. So if we were to assign the width here to auto or even 100%, we should see that it resizes now appropriately. So I think what we can do is we can actually take, since we've duplicated this width, we can take this height auto and we can put this up into this rule, and then we can just include the main card within that and delete these, and I think it should work just fine. So let's resize it, and you can see that it works just fine. And you can see that all we had to do was add this little block of code to make it mobily responsive. But I don't want to leave you hanging on this one. I said throughout the whole video, we want to go mobile first, mobile first. So I want to stay true to that and show you how to make this mobily responsive from a mobile first perspective or strategy. This desktop first approach worked pretty well because we originally created this from that approach, but ideally we would have created the original card from a mobile first perspective. So I'm going to show you how to convert that. So let's delete our media query that we just created. You'll see that it goes back to being cut off and not being mobily responsive. And now what I want to do is create that mobile first design. So instead of a max width, we're going to write a media query where we have a mid width, which is going to be 576 pixels. We'll just go with that. So anything greater than a mobile device is going to have whatever styles we put in here. Now the cool thing about media queries and breakpoints is that you don't have to duplicate all of your CSS. A lot of styles are going to be applied similarly across devices. So for example, the color of this button and this text and these backgrounds, that's not going to change based on whether we're on a mobile or desktop device. So we don't need to rewrite those. Likewise, our text is going to stay the same. We're going to have the same font style no matter what. So really the only things that you have to alter between breakpoints is going to be layout related properties. So what I want to start with is the overall card. So if you remember, in the top part of the CSS we have a rule for card. And right now we're giving it an explicit width and an explicit height. Now, if you remember from a mobile first perspective, everything that's not within the media query itself is going to apply to a mobile device. So naturally, when we're on a mobile device, we do not want these explicit widths and heights. So let me go ahead and comment those out for a second. And what you're going to see is that we've already done a lot better. So the overall card is the right width and height now, but we've got some problems going on within the bottom left and bottom right sections. Now we don't want to get rid of these widths and heights altogether. So let's go ahead and take those out of the main card and then scroll down to our media query, and we'll target the card element and paste in those rules again. So now we want to give it a width of 600 and a height of 400 on any device greater than a mobile device, or 576 pixels. So let's go ahead and resize this, and it should break somewhere around here. So right there, you saw it. So that was where our breakpoint was. And you'll see that based on the explicit width and height we've given it, it's not really fitting correctly. So we can actually change this. It should work just fine. So maybe we'll say something like, I don't know, 550 pixels. So that gets it fitting on the screen, and then the height can go ahead and stay at 400 pixels. So now, as we have our mobile device, it's somewhat responsive, and then as we go to anything greater than a mobile device, it stays as this card. The next thing that we want to look at is the bottom left and the bottom right sections. So here are the styles that we have for those. And you'll see that we've given them widths of 50% each. So in this case, when we're on a mobile device, we do not want these widths to be 50%. We want them to be 100%. So let's go ahead and comment this out. And when we do that, it's going to have the default width of auto, which is going to be 100%. So by default, it's going to be 100%. And if we comment out both of these, I think we should start to see something that makes a little bit more sense. So you'll see that we have some auto. Actually, no, I said that wrong. We cannot just use it as auto. We need the text to span 100% width of its container. So in these styles, we need to, I guess, go ahead and set a width of 100%. So that fixes this section. And then we'll come down here and set a width of 100%, and that should pull this one to the right. All right, so we're looking good there. And I think, for the most part, we have our mobile design complete. So I think this is exactly what we want. So our mobile design is complete. We just need to make this desktop design look a little bit better because as of right now, it obviously is missing an entire section. So really we can just, let's go ahead and delete the width of 50%, even the commented out section here. And then we'll go down to our query at the bottom that says anything greater than a mobile device. And we're going to target the bottom left section and the bottom right section. And here we're going to give it a width of 50% just like we had before. And now you'll see that it fits just perfectly, and as we resize it, it resizes perfectly on a mobile device. So that is the difference. It's very subtle, especially because our project is very simple. There's not, hundreds of styles. But the difference between a mobile first and a desktop first design is really important, and you really have to internalize that as a full stack web developer. All right, that wraps it up for this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it, learned a little bit about responsive design, and in the next couple videos we're going to be covering CSS Grid and Flexbox, and we'll do a couple really cool projects with those, so I'm really looking forward to that. If you don't mind, hit the like button on this video and subscribe to the channel so that you can see those tutorials in the future. And until next time, I'll see you later.